Dear ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to tonight's live stream. My name is Katrin Becker and I'm very happy to have two extraordinary guests tonight, the artist Jonas Staal and the curator and writer Raimar Stange. First, we are going to see a presentation by Jonas Staal that introduces us to his artistic practice. Jonas Staal participates in the exhibition Democracy Today, Problems of Representation at the Kindle with the installation New World Summit Rojava. It presents the work of a parliament conceived and ultimately built by the artist, his studio and the group Democratic Self-Administration of Rojava, which follows the principle of stateless democracy in the region of northern Syria. The focus is on aspects such as local self-government, gender equality, and a communal economy. Jonas Staal's presentation will be followed by a conversation between the artist and Raimar Stange. Before I give the floor to Jonas, I would very much like to thank the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands that greatly supported both the exhibition at Kindle as well as tonight's event. Enjoy the evening, everybody, and dear Jonas Staal, we look forward to follow your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrin, and thank you, Raimar, for the invitation and the introduction, to Kindle Center for Contemporary Art for hosting this talk and our conversation, and also to everyone in the organizing backend, Alexander, Georg, thanks so much for putting this together, and for all of you for taking the time to listen to me. So I want to take the opportunity to address some of my works through the thematic of Democracy Today, Problems of Representation, the exhibition curated by Raimar at Kindle that Katrin just introduced. And the starting point of the exhibition is a situation in which a crisis of democracy is perceived as such problems of representation. And this crisis in democracy is described in the curatorial statement, and I quote here, as a situation in which freedoms and options for political participation are being restricted or their use is declining, while the influence of so-called global players in political decisions is growing. And this comes as a result of pressures of burgeoning right-wing populism around the world, the mediatisation of politics, and the tension between inclusion and exclusion in decision-making processes. End of quote from the curatorial statement. Of course, we can ask the question whether this is not a crisis that is inherent to liberal capitalist democracy as such. Vladimir Lenin famously used the term democratism, not democracy, but democratism, to describe what he considered a bourgeois system engineered to protect the interests of the tradesmen, the manufacturers, and the proprietor classes. Then democracy, in contrast to democratism, would be achieved through another kind of model, through another set of actions, namely collective ownership over the means of production. So democracy here is less about representation and relates more to common ownership. In that sense, it might be helpful to speak of democracies in the plural. Liberal or capitalist democracy has proven historically and in the present to stand absolutely opposed or often opposed, for example, to Salvador Allende's democratic socialism or the stateless democracy of the Kurdish autonomous Rojava region that Katrin already mentioned in her introduction. So the term democracy as such can be considered as a site of struggle. The word has a plurality of realities. It's a political imaginary. Democracy represents a political imaginary that is continuously contested by different ideological formations and formations of power. So differentiating democracies, making visible how these different conceptions of democracy work in practice, and trying to contribute through the field of art and culture to furthering emancipatory democratic practices, this has been a key to my practice as an artist and as a propaganda researcher. And tonight I want to take the chance to explore some of these different conceptions of conflicting democracies through my practice. And for this, I'm going to share my screen with you. There we go. So I want to start to discuss my artistic and political organization, the New World Summit. This is a series of alternative parliaments for stateless and blacklisted organizations that I create with my team in theaters, in art institutions, and public spaces since 2012. Here you see the first New World Summit that took place in Berlin as part of the 7th Berlin Biennial in the Sophiensäle Theater in 2012. And this project, this artistic and political organization, emerged in response to the ongoing war on terror. Our aim was to challenge the us versus them master narrative that was propagated through this ongoing war, that is propagated through this ongoing war. Is it possible, we try to ask as the organizers of the alternative parliament, is it possible that politicized civil society that opposes the war on terror has more in common with the organizations persecuted in the war than with the criminal terrorist states that claim to speak and act in our name? So in the alternative parliaments, in the arenas of the New World Summit, that you see some impressions here, we tried to reassemble, to recompose who or what is to be defined as us in the us versus them dichotomy. And in these gatherings, this process was led by representatives of stateless and blacklisted organizations that stem from long histories of anti-colonial, liberational, as well as socialist struggle. So rather than following the war on terror narrative, and the main story of the war on terror, that terrorists act out of a kind of fundamental inert hatred of democracy, we try to contrast capitalist imperialist democracy underlying the war on terror with communalist and collectivist and stateless democracies. So you could say the parliaments become an arena in which different contesting notions of democracy manifest. Now, the morphologies, the visual forms of the alternative parliaments play an important role in this process of recomposing collectivities, recomposing us in the us versus them dichotomy. Our parliaments tend to double in form, breaking with pre-existing hierarchies in liberal assembly, enabling a bodily intimacy with political representatives speaking from within rather than to the crowd. The chair in traditional parliaments, which breaks the possibility of a collective into individualized sovereign representatives, is rejected in these visual constellations in favor of the communalist dynamic of the bench. Most of our parliaments and temporary embassies are constructed through the bench, and that builds on an interesting heritage of the bench in utopian architectures and political practice. So in other words, what we try to do with the New World Summit is to translate emancipatory ideology, emancipatory takes on democratic practice into emancipatory form, to contribute through emancipatory form to furthering emancipatory ideology. Now, organizing the New World Summit also led to more intimate collaborations, amongst others with the autonomous Rojava government in northern Syria, which is West Kurdistan, that invited us to develop a new public parliament for its stateless democracy. And as Catherine already mentioned in the introduction, stateless democracy is a political model based on local self-governance, gender equality, and communal economy. The parliament is created as a public space, and as such, it rejects the separation between the people and the governing class. Its circular form emphasizes collective representation and collective ownership, surrounded by pillars on which key terms of the Rojavan social contract are represented. Concepts such as self-governance, gender equality, social ecology. It operates in that sense as a kind of spatial manifesto. The parliament translates revolutionary ideology into a spatial form, but simultaneously operates as an arena where these ideas are furthered in practice. In this context, the notion of statelessness in stateless democracy no longer stands for a position of radical precarity or powerlessness. It's often how we tend to read statelessness. But here, statelessness becomes a precondition for liberation from the patriarchal, nationalist, and capitalist capture of the state. One of the leaders of the Kurdish revolutionary movement, Abdullah Öcalan, he furthers he proposes an analysis of the state, which has a kind of micro and macro dimension. He speaks, for example, of man's small state. Then he means the family and the way that statist ideology replicates in the context of the family. But he also speaks of the state as a colony of capital, as something that suggests a power through unity, by connecting national identity with a specific territorial, through a specific territory, but in actuality only serves a larger capitalist interest. So he has this, he analyzes the state in these various, from these various points of view. Rojava's Stateless Democracy fundamentally redefines the conditions based on which we can conceptualize democracy. From delegating representation, which is the practice of democracy in liberal and capitalist democracy, we move to communal self-governance, to self-representation, to collective self-representation. From democracy as a glorifying mechanism for nationalism and patriarchy, we move to a proportional representation of gender and different nationalities. All of the council-based parliaments in Rojava have a 40% women quota. Every political meeting is chaired by a woman as well as a man, always by co-chairs. Women are only elected by women organizations. There's a separate women's army. There's a proportional representation of Assyrian, Kurdish, Arab, Yazidi populations in each of the commune. So there's a proportional representation of gender and different nationalities. And from democracy operating within constitutions premised on the preservation of private property, we move to a social contract structured on common ownership. So democracy in this context, in this practice, becomes an operational word for a collective form of self-determination. A second example for my practice that I wanted to share with you is the artistic and political campaign New Unions. Whereas the New World Summit aims at reclaiming the parliament as a space of radical democratic practice, New Unions can best be described as a campaign for the collective imagination. Its starting point is the Brexit vote that reduced the future of Europe and of the European Union as a transnational project into a leave versus remain dichotomy. And here again, the starting point in a way is a recomposition of a dichotomy from the us versus them dichotomy to the leave versus remain dichotomy. The leave camp was claimed by ultranationalist and right-wing forces demanding the return to a nativist England that never existed in the first place, a kind of retro science fiction that projects a mythical past into a common future. The Remain camp, on the other hand, was claimed by the Eurocratic austerity elite that have imposed structural economic terrorism on countries like Italy and Greece. And that is important to mention in the sense that the Brexit vote essentially was not a choice. It was an operation to take hostage the possibility for an emancipatory horizon of transnational unionization through two camps, Leave, Remain, that only reinforce each other's reactionary politics. It is a hostage, essentially, of the collective political imagination, a hostage of the possibility to think that there are other choices beyond the Leave versus Remain dichotomy. Our campaign then became one to insist on these third, fourth, and fifth scenarios. We organized assemblies structured around the stars of the EU flag, scattered and sinking or rising from the floor, embodying a union both in crisis and transformation. And in these environments, Feminist Initiative in Sweden proposed a feminist union. The Greek Antasia proposed an internationalist union. The Catalan Popular Unity Candidacy, a communalist union. The Norwegian Red Party, a stateless union. This struggle to reclaim the collective transnational imagination also translated into direct collaborations with pan-European political movements such as the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025, co-founded by Yanis Varoufakis. Building on the fast-forward symbol of the movement that you can see here, designed by composer Brian Eno, we created a historical morphological dialogue towards a pan-European constructivism that translated into these reconstructed unionized stars appearing at the founding event of the movement of DiEM25 in Amsterdam, in Athens, and Brussels. Artworks that operate as comrades assembling alongside those gathering to struggle for the transnational union as a project of political, economic, and environmental solidarity. These attempts through the New Union's campaign to contribute to the shaping of a transnational imaginary went hand in hand with prefiguring new transnational infrastructures. For the activists in the Forum for the Future of Culture in Poland, we conceptualized the unionization of the Polish parliament, quadrupling its existing hierarchical setup into an oval-shaped space where the national Polish emblem mutates into a pan-European horizon. It's an attempt to hijack the symbolic legitimacy of the existing parliament and repurpose it, move it into a radically different political project. A similar approach we developed with the Scottish independence movement, which had a huge backing in the 2014 independence vote to separate from the United Kingdom, but whose constituents in vast majority at the same time wish to remain part of the European Union. And that's relevant because here the idea of separatism manifests not as isolationism, but as a demand to negotiate one's own dependencies away from the Union of the UK and remain in the Union of the European Union. With various representatives of the Scottish independence movement, we began conceptualizing a parliament that would embody this separatist solidarity, this separatist interdependency, which manifested on a decommissioned oil rig in the North Sea, located exactly on the borders of the UK and EU waters. Placed on top of the oil rig, you can see the parliament here. Placed on top of the oil rig, this extraterritorial parliament was as much Scottish as it was European. It builds on a space exactly in between overlapping political geographies. So in the New Union's campaign, the notion of democracy, or a notion of fundamental democracy in terms of collective governance and collective ownership, is specifically directed to the collective imagination, a democratization of the collective imagination in relationship to transnational forms of political governance, to break the dominant reactionary dichotomies that keep our political and cultural actionabilities hostage. So from the artwork as Stateless Parliament to the artwork as transnational campaign, I want to move to a recent project titled Training for the Future that I developed together with dramaturg and curator Florian Malzacher, and which takes the form of what we call a utopian training camp. We created the first two editions of this neo-constructivist camp in the former industrial remnants of the Ruhr area that you can see here, at a time in which we face intersecting political, economic, and environmental crisis, a time in which the very idea of the future and the possibility of a future history is being undone. In this training camp, in the 2019 edition, of which you see some impressions here, for a period of 3 days, 10 hours a day, 20 trainers consisting of futurologists, progressive hackers, extraterritorial activists, transnationalists, and art activists, trained 450 trainees in reclaiming the means of production of the future in this time of dystopian normativity, in a time in which we can only imagine the future as a worsening of the present. Examples are trainings in intimacy encryption by hacker Heath Bunting that you can see here, to develop intimate knowledges amongst fellow activists and organizers that can be used as a code, as a kind of intimate code to resist interrogation. Trainings by the ISD, the Initiative Schwarzer Menschen in Deutschland, and Global EV focused on developing new common decolonized historiographies, dismantling ingrained racialized narratives and values to enable possible alternative future narratives and forms of future history. Trainings by the Army of Love focused on redistributing intimacy and love, even with those we feel no personal connection or desire for, and in a way proposing also a critique on the history of the socialist project, which often focuses on redistribution in a material sense, but not necessarily in an intimate sense. Trainings by the Kurdish women's movement used Augusto Boal's methodology known as the theater of the oppressed to dismantle patriarchal mentalities and behaviors. In their words, to kill the dominant male, which is actually a slogan proposed by Abdullah Öcalan that I referenced earlier, in which he means not so much literally to kill men, but to kill the dominant male mentality that underlies the state politics. And trainings by public movement focused on the choreographies of state violence on one hand, and there were trainings by Arivati and the Schwabingrad Ballet in leaderless protest choreographies on the other, using swarm techniques to create leaderless compositions, leaderless choreographies to propose or propagate alternate collectivities in the face of oppression. This year, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we mounted a decentralized edition of the training camps. So rather than bringing everyone physically to one location, trainings happened in parallel in Bogota, in Buenos Aires, New York, Manila, Johannesburg, Derrick, in Rojava itself, in Venice and Zurich, focused on the title Collectives, Collectivity and Collectivization, an attempt to create a kind of planetary choreography at the exact moment where we were, as a result of the pandemic, most atomized, or in which our already existing atomization became increasingly visible. Each training took place within the conditions considered safe in the respective environment, insisting on alternative forms of collective intimacy and organizing work in the process of reclaiming a common horizon through the current crisis. So whereas the New World Summit and new unions are strongly premised on the assembly, a model we tend to associate with democratic decision-making processes, training for the future is premised on the training, which we tend to associate with more hierarchical and more disciplinary models of organization. But here I want to return once more to this fundamental question: what exactly is it that defines this notion of democracy when we speak of problems of representation in democracy today? An effective training in training for the future. An effective training turns a trainee into a potential trainer, transferring embodied knowledge from one person to the other, spreading tools and methods to produce alternative futurities across new communities and constituents. And in our training camps, trainers participate as trainees in other trainers' trainings, meaning that agencies, what defines a trainer, what defines a trainee, rotate, and in that process, the boundaries between them become increasingly porous. The aim here, the aim of the Utopian training camp, is to enable a redistribution of tools and knowledges that contribute to reclaiming the means of production of the future and to occupy the future as a site of common struggle. And it is this furthering of commonality and collectivity that is the democratic force at play. So we tend to reduce democratic participation into the form of voting, to a representative form, the handing over, the delegating of our voice. In Dutch, vote literally means voice, to another. And this can be a form of acting. Voting can be a form of democratic participation, but it's only one of many democratic tools through which we can fundamentally assert the collective right to self-determination. And I tend to come back to this term more often throughout this talk when it comes to defining what a fundamental emancipatory democracy entails. So when we approach democracy beyond the question of the vote, but if we approach democracy as a practice of redistribution, as a practice of collective ownership, then that brings me to address the collective action lawsuit Collectivize Facebook. It's a project, a campaign that I initiated together with human rights lawyer Jan Vermont. And in our indictment against Facebook, which we will be submitting to the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, in our indictment, we argue that Facebook infringes upon the right to self-determination of peoples and individuals in various ways. We argue that the corporation instrumentalizes users as neo-feudal data workers, as our data constitutes Facebook's profit model. Facebook employs racist algorithms and is used in various surveillance capacities, infringe upon privacy, and disproportionately impacts democratic elections, of which data capture and targeted campaigns of Cambridge Analytica have been a recent and well-covered example. Further, Facebook has actively and willfully advised authoritarian regimes, such as that of Duterte in the Philippines. And as a result, lawyer Jan Vermon and me, in our indictment, we argue that the very structure of ownership of Facebook is what essentially undermines our individual and collective right to self-determination. Therefore, our demand is to have Facebook recognized as a public domain and to consequently transfer its ownership to its 2.8 billion active users active on the platform today. As unpaid data workers, we worked for it. We worked for Facebook. We were never paid by Facebook. Now we have to own it. It's time to socialize social media. To clarify, to collectivize Facebook does not mean to reform Facebook or to nationalize Facebook. We aim to turn trillion-dollar companies like Facebook, but we can also think of Amazon, of Bayer that owns Monsanto, Alphabet that owns Google, etc., etc. We aim to turn trillion-dollar companies into new models of transnational cooperatives, meaning collectively owned, collectively governed by their users. That is, also following the Rojavan practice of stateless democracy, a potential pathway to create transnational unions beyond the corporation and beyond the state. And maybe Facebook, in that sense, is a good metaphor for the problems of democracy if we think of it in the context of liberal and capitalist context. Yes, we can participate in Facebook, but as long as we don't own what our participation produces as data being the new oil, this participation is meaningless, is only part of a perpetual process of self-precarization. It contributes, our participation then contributes to our powerlessness rather than into our stakes in the domains in which we work and operate. In these past months, Jan Vermon and I have organized various pre-trials, preliminary tribunals, to introduce our indictment and invite publics to join our case as co-claimants, but also to invite witnesses to witness the future that becomes possible if we win the case. Witnessing the future is an essential part of Collectivize Facebook as a campaign, because while our indictment aims to provide a legal framework, a legal pathway to reclaim common ownership over trillion-dollar companies, that still leaves, of course, the question, how would we govern these collectively as transnational cooperatives? What would be the decision-making structures for 2.3 billion co-owners of Facebook? Sorry, 2.8 billion co-owners of Facebook. Do we ban advertisement? Do we ensure encryption? Do we decentralize servers? Or do we even dismantle its infrastructure as a whole, consider its heavy reliance on extractive industries and its disproportionate environmental impact? And for anyone that is listening that shares our argumentation, we invite you to read the full indictment and join as co-claimants at collectivize.org, where when we file our indictment to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, we need to be in the thousands. We need to be in the tens of thousands, in the hundreds of thousands, in the million to make a collective case for collectivization. Of course, the model of the collective action lawsuit against Facebook and other trillion-dollar companies cannot succeed without broad alliances with popular mass movements and precarious workers. And for this reason, we are also involved with the global Make Amazon Pay campaign, for which we developed the visual morphology that you see here. On Black Friday, November 27, 2020, this campaign, Make Amazon Pay, coordinated by Uni Global Union and Progressive International, organized parallel strikes, demonstrations, and projections at Amazon warehouses across the world in India, Bangladesh, Australia, Brazil, Mexico, various European countries, and the United States, including at CEO's Jeff Bezos' mansion, as you can see here. The visual morphology of the campaign consists of a doubling of the Amazon icon, the icon that can be read both as a smile and as a kind of forward arrow. Placed on a red canvas, the doubled arrow emphasizes the demand to return return rights to Amazon workers, return their labor by providing fair income, return social security, the right to unionize, return the environmental cost of carbon excess, and return profits made through structural tax avoidance. Simultaneously hijacking and socializing the Amazon visual identity is a first step towards replacement. Hijacking and socializing the Amazon visual identity, it's a first step towards replacement. It opens a visual portal towards a future Amazon that is owned and governed by its workers and by its users. It is a collectivized Amazon. So, in the example so far, collective representation, redistribution, common ownership become the foundation for comradeship, for an articulation of collectivity or unity or common purpose in the process of furthering emancipatory life forms. But of course, the question remains with regards to the limits of the collective defined in these projects that I showed you so far in relationship to non-human, more than human, other than human political actors. And the final example of which I'm showing you an image now that I want to share with you, this final example relates specifically to this question, how to expand our concept of comradeship, how to expand our understanding of collectivity. The project is titled Interplanetary Species Society, and it responds specifically to the current endeavors to turn humans into an interplanetary species by building settlements on the red planet, Mars. One of the most prominent actors in the endeavor to turn humans into an interplanetary species is, of course, the organization SpaceX, founded by Elon Musk, that aims to terraform Mars as a backup planet, in his words, in case of environmental or nuclear catastrophe on Earth. And the image that you see here and the next one are projections of SpaceX Martian settlements to be built in the first phases of terraforming the planet. Now, apart from the deep cynicism of sending workers to terraform a backup planet for the 1%, it is important to consider the vocabulary used by organizations like SpaceX, which shamefully replicates colonial language by declaring a new generation of pioneers and declaring the Mars colony. Interplanetary Species Society, the project that I want to discuss with you, and that you can see an impression here, takes the form of an alternative, experimental biosphere that calls for humans to think of ourselves as guests, not as pioneers, to engage in interplanetary cooperation, not colonization. And most of all, to engage our thinking of interplanetarism into a form of intraplanetarism. Intraplanetarism meaning a deepening of our role and our comradely bonds within ecologies that sustain us on Earth. The project was located in the Reaktorhallen, a former underground nuclear facility in Stockholm. And it seemed relevant to me that building the facility underground, this nuclear facility, was once intended to protect the surface from radiation. While in the course of the unfolding climate collapse in which we find ourselves now, it will be us who will be forced underground, deeper within Earth, intraplanetary, to protect ourselves from the radiation of the surface. Our biosphere, the biosphere of Interplanetary Species Society, gathers humans together with neo-constructivist ammonites, proletarian plants, meteorites, to enable a form of assembly, a form of gathering, not only within the ecologies of our present, but also with the ecologies of the deep past. The neo-constructivist ammonites, for example, that you see here, are fossils of ammonites, a family of octopus and squid that lived between 300 and 66 million years ago and that perished in the 5th mass extinction. Now, it might seem that human life and ammonite life is vastly different in terms of its lived time and organic composition. But the ammonites are fossils, and we are fossils in the making. And further, the ammonite is literally fossil fuel, millions of years of aggregated, decomposed bodies of animals and plants that racial capitalism burns to accelerate the present and undo the possibility of a future in which humans can survive in a meaningful way. The constructivist bodies and slogans of the Ammonites, of course, refer to the work of the constructivist and productivist artists in the Russian Revolution. And that might seem paradoxical, as these artists embraced the industrialist paradigm. But artists like Popova, Stepanova, Rodchenko also developed a theory that they refer to as the object as comrade. The idea that in revolution, commodities would not just become collective property, but revolutionary agents in their own right. In interplanetary species society, this idea of the object as human, of the non-human, in interplanetary species society, this idea is expanded into the political recognition of the non-human comrade. So from object as comrade to non-human comrade, with whom we share an ecology from deep past to the present and an urgent struggle to ensure deep futures. So the Stateless Parliament, the transnational campaign, the utopian training camp, the Collectivize $1 trillion company, the experimental biosphere. These projects that I try to introduce to you, they represent morphologies that are less about overcoming the crisis of representation in liberal and capitalist democracy, but more focused to confront and overcome a crisis inherent to liberal and capitalist democracy as such. They aim to contribute to enable and further emancipatory democratic practices through collective representation, redistribution, collective forms of ownership across human and other than human comrades. A democracy that builds on a cosmology of ancestors and successors, from comrade fossil to comrade human, a world of many worlds in a biosphere for all. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me, and I look forward to being in conversation with you, Raimar.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was a lot. But please, let's focus now on your new World Summit Rojava, because that's the work we show in our exhibition, Demokratie, heute. I don't know how to start, maybe with a simple question. For some years, the new World Summits, as we saw in your presentation, were designed as nomadic parliaments. Now in Rojava, you change the strategy. Why? To gain a sustainable structure?
Yeah, the New World Summit, as an artistic and political organization, was conceptualized to create temporary parliaments for stateless and blacklisted organizations. But in the process, many of the groups that we worked with, amongst which the National Democratic Movement in the Philippines, the National Liberation Movement of Azawad, and the Autonomous Government of Rojava, the Autonomous Government of West Kurdistan, also became very close partners in collaborative practices. And when the autonomous government in Rojava commissioned us to develop with their representatives an alternative parliament, an alternative public parliament, it didn't seem a break with that previous work, because our idea was always to create a stateless parliament for and with stateless and autonomous groups. And Rojava is a stateless democracy. It is a place where the parliament might have a material and permanent form, but it's also a political context that consistently rejects the state as an organizing model. So its permanence doesn't make it less stateless, if you understand what I mean, because it operates in an environment, in a political ideology of stateless democracy, as it's been developed by leaders like Abdullah Öcalan, like Sakina Jansiz, that rejects the model of the state or state mentality indefinitely.
Yeah, that's okay, but now you have the chance to work on the long term. You have the chance to, not only for maybe the first example you show, the New World Summit at Berlin Biennial, that was maybe for, I don't know, for 4 weeks, and then it was over. I think now you work for years with this one parliament. Well,
yes, but of course that's also a result of the the organizing body that commissions us to make the parliament. The parliament is commissioned by the Rojava government, developed with the Rojava government, owned by the Rojava government, and operated by the Rojava government. So I remain, of course, very actively involved, and we also see it as a space that is an expression of international solidarity, as a space that represents a kind of cultural meeting point, and point of a space of cultural exchange. But essentially, it belongs to the government, not to me.
One of the principles of the Rojava parliament is localism. Is the power of localism and self-government strong enough to protect against the power of global player? To protect the identity of these people, to uphold their own language, their own culture, education, food, security, and so on?
I mean, that's a difficult question. The model of stateless democracy, or democratic confederalism, it's also referred to. It's basically an attempt to reverse the investment of power in different layers of political representation. So in Rojava, you start with the commune, you have the municipality, you have the canton, and then you have the trans-cantonal coordination. And that's not so fundamentally different like many of the political models we know, from neighborhood council to municipality to provincial government to national government to senate, you name it. What is different in the Rojavan context is that the agency in each of these layers of government is reversed. So the smaller the political entity, the neighborhood council, the municipality, the more executive power they have. So the more decision-making capabilities they have. The larger the political entity, the more they have coordinating functions and less functions for executive decision-making. So it's not as if all the layers of government has disappeared. It's that the center of power relies on the smallest of its components. So there is still a larger coordination, but it follows the autonomous communes, the neighborhood communes. If it does such a model face enormous difficulties? Yes, and of course the Rojava autonomous government is an example of that. They declared themselves independent in 2012 in the midst of the Syrian civil war. They have faced the threats of Assad. They had to fight the Islamic State, which intruded into their region. They have to fight still until the day of today, the Erdogan regime, who has taken various parts of its territories under its control. The world and the interstate system and all of its interests will not suddenly accept radical emancipatory forms of self-governance, and we stand, of course, on a history of its examples, from Salvador Allende to Thomas Sankara. Our history, or emancipatory political history, shows that our alternatives are very real and very successful, and therefore they are a threat to the existing status quo, who tends to fall back on military intervention and in order to squelch, in order to stop the possibility of a different emancipatory political order to come into place. So it's a difficult question to answer, because in a way, the threats that autonomous political projects like Rojava face prove the success of its political model.
Well, in my talk here 1 week ago, the Düsseldorf-based artist Klaus Fettinger described the Rojava work as an utopian model. You just said it's our alternatives are real. So do you accept in the description of a utopian model, or it's more?
I mean, it depends on how you define utopian. I take utopian less from the kind of history of Sir Thomas More. I take it more as, whenever people today use the word utopia, it's generally meant to discredit you, and that tends to be an indication that you're on the good path. Because if there's anything truly utopian, it's to believe that the system of racial capitalist democracy that consumes our common futures and does not allow us to think anything more than 2 generations before our inherent collapse. I mean, if you think that if anyone thinks that this is somehow a feasible pathway that we're on, that is genuinely utopian. So when they use the term against us, I think it signifies that we're on the right path somehow to reclaim the collective imagination over what our world could or should become. But of course, in the general use of the term, the Rojava revolution, its fight against ISIS, its defense against the Erdogan regime, came at the cost of tens of thousands of fighters protecting and sacrificing to make that political project a reality. So utopian, it depends on how you define the term, but with whatever achievement was made, definitely came at a huge and very real cost.
The term radical imagination, is it important for you? Do you work like this?
Yes, it is an important term for me, in the sense that the imagination does not hold immediate political power the way that political institutions hold political power or trillion-dollar companies hold political power. But if we're not able to radically imagine different worlds, then it's also not possible to create these worlds. You will first have to imagine a change before you can realize that change. So I do believe that in that sense, I believe radical imagination is a crucial component, an essential component of any form of emancipatory transformative politics. Yes.
Let's go back to the exhibition. Simple also, are you happy with the presentation of your work? What I mean is not that it's good installed or something like that. What I mean is this, you often say that art that wants to have political power needs concrete links to political organizations. And so does it make sense to show the model of Rojava Parliament here in a white cube in a venue that has no direct alliance to any political movement?
Well, that's a very good question. Of course, the core of the work, the reality of the work, is its existence in the context of Rojava and its existence as a form of a parallel parliament that operates in the city of Eindhoven in the south of the Netherlands, co-programmed with Kurdish diaspora organizations in the Netherlands. But I think that the value for me of the exhibition is still an environment to display or show speculative or partially real propositions, and that allow for different, let's say, morphological analysis and exploration of different visual literacies that are part of alternative practices of world building. And I think there's also a value in having a foot in different institutions to show that there are other forms and practices of art that do not maintain a kind of false separation with politics, but that unite or seek for a dialogue between emancipatory political imagination and emancipatory artistic imagination. I think it's also important to, in a way, reclaim our art institutions as spaces where we can plot and plan and imagine other forms of artistic practice, other relations of art to political reality.
For me, I always think about a little bit exhibition like a kind of a Counterpublic, a platform where you can show ideas and that you don't see in normal media and so on. You agree?
Yes, although of course, like you have mainstream media and you have mainstream art institutions, in the sense like art institutions are also implicated often in maintaining particular, let's say, particular normalities, a particular idea of to maintain particular historiographies, particular values, particular. But yes, if let's say that in the alternative art institutions or institutions open to engage with progressive histories of art or emancipatory histories of art that are willing to revise the dominant canon of Western art history and seek to go beyond this idea of individual autonomy of artists and move towards an ideal of collective autonomy of artists, not individual freedom and freedom of expression, but collective freedom. I think from that perspective, I would totally agree with you. Yes.
For me, it's a problem, and also when I saw most of the picture you showed in your presentation, when we have a look at the audience, it's always people, let's say between 25 and 45, they're all more or less well dressed. They're all better educated. So what I mean is, I like the platform. We have a lot of freedom there compared to the rest of the society, but it's also a limited platform. We always speak to the same people, to people that maybe have already the same ideas we have. Know what I mean?
I mean, in the projects that I'm part of, I don't experience it that way. When I help to develop the assemblies for the Democracy in Europe movement 2025, I hardly know a single person who comes there. For me, it's an entirely new or largely new collective body that I'm operating in. Working with the Rojava autonomous government was also working with a community that I got to know very much in the process of bringing it into being. I mean, I agree with you that, let's say, the bourgeois art institutions have a particular pre-scripted public, but I personally feel that the collaboration with people from the field of progressive law, with social organizers, with progressive political parties, it depends on the constellation with who you work and who you are willing to, as artists in this case, or as cultural practitioners, in what institutional forms or what organizational forms are we willing to see our work operate? If we remain in a space, in the spaces of, let's say, in the bourgeois spaces of art representation, then yes, we will reinforce the publics and interests that are invested there. But I don't think it has to be that way, and I don't experience it that way myself.
You always work in a corporate, collective way. What exactly is your role or your function in this process? You're something like a dirigent or like a manager, or what is your?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the role of art, or what defines art for me, has a lot to do with visual literacy and with morphology, with a capability to read and dialogue through form, and I see this is my role. But of course, this role can take many different manifestations depending on the project. It can be rethinking or articulating the morphology of the alternative parliament, of the alternative court, or the training camp, as I showed in the different examples, like this, where this how this visual literacy manifests is very dependent on the collaborative context in which I operate. But I would say that this is where my role lies.
Okay, already maybe my last question. Today, the German art scene celebrates the 100th birthday of Joseph Beuys. Did he influence your work and your way of thinking? Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. I think for me, encountering the work of Beuys was a very liberatory experience, in the sense that it was someone who had the capability, especially through his involvement with Die Grünen, but also through his own Bureau for Direct Democracy. It was someone who was able to think or to push notions of visual literacy and morphology into the organizational domain, to be able to look at the party as a composition, the party form as a compository form, like someone who I think understood that our definition and our understanding of art cannot be separated from political power and from economic power. If we want to change art, it simultaneously means like who art is for, who can own it, who can see it, who can make it. And to change that means to change also the political conditions through which we understand art. And I think he understood that was a simultaneous struggle. Of course, Beuys is also an extremely complicated figure. I'm familiar with the recent controversies about his reliance on funding by people who were prominent in the Nazi party and continued to use their capital and either greenwash or even potentially sympathized or had ideological sympathies with Beuys. And there's the question, of course, in Beuys of someone who transgressed many disciplinary boundaries between pedagogical work, artistic work, political work, and who at the same time reinforced a kind of idea of a huge megalomaniac idea of artistic authorship, and claimed and in a way appropriated notions of shamanism and kind of combined them with a particular Western idea of the artist genius. These are things that I have less, that these are obviously partially very problematic heritage. But he was also simultaneously a transformational figure who opened ways for artists like myself to conceptualize notions of assemblist art that builds on the performative assembly of political movements, organizational art, and that's in a way where I put the emphasis on in my lecture tonight, the artwork as political campaign, the artwork as parliament, the artwork as biosphere. I think in many ways these are also I inherit these from artists like Beuys.
For Beuys, education was very important. He was a professor in Düsseldorf, and he opens the class. He say everyone can come. That's why they kick him out and so on. Are you a teacher too?
I am a teacher, yes, in the sense that it is for me an important part of my practice. Although I have a tendency to think more of, I tend to try to contribute more to other pedagogical frameworks. So rather than teaching in the school as it exists, I think the utopian training camp, like Training for the Future, is very much a school in some sense. And it's a school that I help to organize with Florian Malzacher, but I also participate in it as a trainee. I help to organize it, but I am trained by the trainings by like any other trainee. And I think that's for me an important approach to understanding, let's say, emancipatory or transformative pedagogy as an environment in which the role of teacher and student, between trainer and trainee, is porous and circulates, and in a way in which the authorship of knowledge is kind of continuously recirculated or rethought. But in a way, the megalomaniac answer would be that, yes, I'm very interested in the field of the pedagogy, but ideally I try to co-imagine my own schools.
Okay, thank you very much. We mentioned the name Florian Malzacher quite often, so I want to that Florian was also the co-editor of our catalog, let's say. And so maybe if you can get it for free at Kindle, and you will get it by post, of course. And so maybe there are questions. I don't know. Georg? Where's Georg? There are no questions. Okay. So Jonas, thanks a lot.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for your work and our exhibition. Do you like did you know in the room it's you, it's Oliver Ressler, and it's Marina Naprushkina?
Good company.
Did you see you don't see installation shots?
I did, yes. I saw it in the video and in the photo documentation. It's a good company.
I think so. I hope so. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Ciao.